My future mother-in-law whispered before the wedding, "Leave my son before it's too late." Simone Garrett was 37 years old the morning her future mother-in-law pressed a folded piece of paper into her palm in the church vestibule and whispered 4 words that Simone did not understand until 6 months later. To the guests straightening their lapels and adjusting their hats in the hallway behind them, she looked like every other bride on a September morning in Memphis, a woman in ivory with her hair pinned and her hands trembling slightly the way hands do before something permanent. She drove a used Buick. She rented a one-bedroom apartment on the east side of town. Her fiancé's family called her Sweet Simone and said it in the way that people say sweet when they mean small. What none of them had thought to look for, what her fiancé Deshawn had never once considered in 3 years of courtship, was why she received a separate piece of mail every quarter from a financial management firm in Nashville, or why her grandfather's name appeared on the deed to a commercial block on Beale Street that had been quietly earning $27,000 a month in lease revenue for the better part of a decade. His mother knew something he did not. The note she pressed into Simone's palm contained 3 words that felt like mercy and landed like prophecy. Simone put it in her purse and walked down the aisle and smiled and said, "I do." 6 months later, sitting alone in the kitchen of the house Deshawn had moved them into with her money, she opened that note for the first time. What happened after that would cost Deshawn everything he had spent 3 years pretending he had built. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The evening light came through the kitchen windows of the house on Parkway Avenue in long gold bars that fell across the countertop, and the pot of soup Simone had left simmering since 4 o'clock. She stood at the stove with a wooden spoon in one hand and her reading glasses pushed up into her hair the way she wore them at the office when she was moving between a document and the room, back and forth, without wanting to set them down. She stirred the soup in slow, even rotations, not thinking about the soup, thinking about the note. She had built these kitchen shelves herself. Not out of necessity, there had been money for a contractor, but because her grandfather had always said that a thing built by your own hands was the only thing you truly understood. He had been a master electrician for 40 years in this city, and he had wired half the buildings on the South End, and he had understood instinctively that knowledge lived in the hands and not in the head. His name was Ernest Garrett, and he had raised Simone from the time she was 9 years old, after her parents' accident. And he had been methodical and unhurried in all things, and had spoken rarely but always to the point. She had inherited from him both the patience and the precision. She was a licensed corporate attorney. She had her own practice, 4 attorneys, 2 paralegals, a small office on Union Avenue that smelled like paper and wood smoke in the winter and cold coffee in the summer. And she had operated it for 7 years with the same steady temperament that her grandfather had brought to every circuit and junction box he ever touched. She did not perform urgency. She did not mistake motion for progress. She built things that held. Deshawn Garrett, he had taken her name when they married, a gesture she had found meaningful at the time, had come into her life at a professional conference in Nashville 3 years before the wedding. He was in commercial real estate, charming in the way of men who have learned that charm is a tool, and he had made her laugh twice in one evening, which was not easy to do. He was attentive. He called first. He showed up on time. He asked about her practice with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, and she had found that uncommon enough to pay attention to. Her grandfather met him once at a Sunday dinner and shook his hand and said very little, which was normal, and afterward told Simone that he seemed like a man who was still deciding who he was. She had thought about that and decided it was true of most people at 34 and let it go. She had no idea her grandfather was right in a way that had nothing to do with youth. They had been engaged 14 months when Deshawn came home one evening smelling of a cologne she had not purchased, a slight and particular difference, and set his phone face down on the counter before he kissed her cheek, and she filed both details the way she filed anomalies in a contract, without comment, without conclusion, with the clean intention of returning to them when she had more information. On the morning of the wedding, in the vestibule of Resurrection Baptist Church, while her bridesmaids adjusted the train of her dress and her maid of honor checked the flowers, Deshawn's mother, Hattie, had appeared at her elbow. Hattie Monroe was 68 years old, a small woman with careful eyes and a posture that communicated everything she did not say out loud. She had never been unkind to Simone. She had also never been fully warm, which Simone had attributed to the reserve of a woman protective of her only son. Hattie took Simone's right hand in both of hers and pressed a folded square of paper into her palm and leaned close and said, quietly and without drama, "Leave my son before it's too late." And then she stepped back and rearranged her face and walked toward the sanctuary with her hands folded in front of her. Simone stood in the vestibule for 4 full seconds. Then her maid of honor said her name, and she put the note in her small purse and zipped it closed and walked toward the music. She should have opened it then. She knew that now. But she had been 20 minutes from marrying a man she had loved for 3 years, and she had told herself that Hattie Monroe was a complicated woman with complicated feelings about her son's choices. And she had walked down the aisle and meant every word she said and taken a photograph afterward in the garden that was framed on the wall of the living room, where it hung for exactly 6 months and 2 weeks before she took it down. The note lived in her purse the entire time, unopened. She did not think about it often. She was busy. She had a practice to run and a marriage to build, and a husband who was, in the early months, affectionate and present, and only occasionally unreachable by phone for stretches of the afternoon that she had no good explanation for. The discovery came on a Wednesday in February, 5 months and 12 days after the wedding. She had stayed late at the office to review a contract negotiation that needed to close by Friday, and when she came home at 9:30 the house was dark, except for the kitchen light, which Deshawn had left on the way he always did when he went to bed early. She set her bag on the table. She poured a glass of water. She noticed his phone on the kitchen counter, face up, screen still lit. She was not snooping. She was reaching past it to set her glass down. The notification on the screen was visible before she looked away. It was a message. The name above it was simply the letter K. The first 8 words of the preview were enough. Her hands did not shake. She stood at the counter for a long moment with the water glass in her hand. She was a corporate attorney. She understood exactly what it meant to have information before the other party knew you had it. She set the glass down. She picked up her own phone. She did not touch his. She went to her home office, closed the door, and sat down at her desk. She opened her laptop. She was systematic and unhurried the way she was always systematic and unhurried. And she started at the beginning the way her grandfather had always started at the beginning of any job, checking the panel, identifying every circuit, understanding the load before you touched a single wire. She opened the joint account they had established at the start of the marriage. She exported 6 months of statements. She went through them line by line. What she found was not dramatic in any single entry. It was only dramatic in aggregate. The way a structural failure is never one thing but always the accumulation of small decisions that compound over time until the weight exceeds the design. Restaurant charges on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons she had not been at. A hotel in Germantown, one night in October, registered to their shared card, while Deshawn had told her he was at a conference in Nashville. A second hotel charge in December on the same date he had told her he was visiting his brother in Jackson. 3 wire transfers to an account she did not recognize, each for $800, spaced 6 weeks apart. She built a timeline, she labeled columns, she cross-referenced dates against the travel calendar they kept on the refrigerator. The pattern was not ambiguous once you looked at it with clear eyes. He had been doing this since at least August. Before the wedding, 16 months of deception laid out in a spreadsheet she could have named anything but chose to name simply evidence. She opened her desk drawer and retrieved a small leather notebook her grandfather had given her when she passed the bar. She wrote the name K and a question mark at the top of a clean page. She wrote the dates, she wrote the amounts, she wrote the hotel names. She moved with the same deliberate calm that had always defined her at the hardest moments of her career. The moments when a negotiation had gone sideways and the room was looking at her and she needed to be the steadiest person present. She was done pretending there was another explanation. She opened her purse. She found the small zippered pocket. She took out the folded square of paper, still crisp because she had been careful not to crumple it even without knowing why, and she opened it on the desk under the lamp. Hattie Monroe's handwriting was small and slanted and entirely legible. The note said, "He has done this before. He will do it again. You deserve better. I am sorry I did not tell you sooner." Simone read it twice. She folded it closed. She placed it on top of the spreadsheet printout. She picked up her phone and called Claudette Hines. Claudette had been her mentor at the firm where Simone clerked after law school, and she had known Simone for 14 years, and she had been the first person Simone called when the practice opened and the first person she thought of now. Her voice on the phone was alert despite the hour, the way the voices of attorneys who have handled real cases are always alert when someone they trust calls without preamble. "I need you tomorrow," Simone said. "I need a full day." Claudette said, "I'll be there at 8. Some things you do not need to explain twice." Claudette arrived at 9 the next morning with coffee she had made herself and a yellow legal pad she had owned for so long that the cover was worn soft. She sat across from Simone at the kitchen table and reviewed everything without interruption. The statements, the timeline, the hotel receipts Simone had pulled from the shared email account that Deshawn had added her to for travel logistics and never removed her from. The note from Hattie Monroe, which Claudette read and set down and picked up and read again. "He used the joint account for all of it," Claudette said. "Yes, which means he understood it was marital money he was spending." Simone nodded. "Then this is not complicated," Claudette said. "It is only careful." She walked Simone through what a formal separation would require under Tennessee law. The joint account would be subject to equitable distribution, but the commercial property Simone held through her grandfather's estate trust was a protected asset. It had been established long before the marriage and was titled in the trust, not in her name alone, which meant it was both hers and untouchable. The practice, which she had incorporated before the engagement, was similarly protected. What Deshawn had believed, based on conversations Simone now recalled with different understanding, was that the practice was the full extent of her financial picture. He had never asked about the trust. He had never asked about the block on Beale Street. He had seen a woman with a modest car and a rented apartment before the marriage and had drawn his own conclusions. People who underestimate you are doing you a favor. Her grandfather had said that. She had always known it was true. Claudette recommended a forensic financial review to document the exact scope of marital funds spent on the parallel relationship. She had a firm she used for exactly this purpose. She made the call from Simone's kitchen table while Simone refilled both their coffee cups. The forensic review came back in 3 business days. The firm Claudette used was thorough in the way that only firms with long institutional memory are thorough, which meant they looked not only at what was there, but at what the pattern implied about what might have been obscured. The 22,000 was a floor, not a ceiling. There were ATM withdrawals at locations Deshawn had never mentioned visiting, on dates he had accounted for with explanations that did not survive contact with geography. There were 2 charges to a jeweler in Midtown, one in October and one in January, for items that had never appeared in their home. The report noted, without editorial comment, that the pattern was consistent and deliberate, and that it bore structural resemblance to activity documented in financial fraud proceedings, which was a precise and careful way of saying that whoever had done this had done it before, and knew how not to leave large footprints. Claudette reviewed the report over the phone while Simone sat in her office on Union Avenue. When Claudette finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "He was very confident you weren't looking." "He was right," Simone said, "until he wasn't." By Friday morning, Simone drove out to East Memphis to see Hattie Monroe. She had not called ahead. She pulled up to the small brick house on Rains Road at 10 in the morning and knocked, and Hattie had opened the door and looked at her with the expression of a woman who had been expecting this visit for 6 months and was relieved it had finally arrived. She led Simone to the kitchen and poured 2 glasses of sweet tea without asking and sat down. "How long?" Simone asked. Hattie was quiet for a moment. "There was a woman before you," she said. "They were together 2 years. He handled her money and she trusted him, and when it was over she had less than she started with and he had more." She folded her hands on the table. "I told him then that I wouldn't cover for him again. I didn't know how to tell you without you thinking I was the kind of mother who interferes." She looked at Simone carefully. "I waited too long. I know that." "What was her name?" Simone asked. Hattie told her. Simone wrote it down in the leather notebook. That evening, she went home and made dinner. She set the table for 2. She asked Deshawn about his day, and he told her about a property showing that had gone well, and she listened and asked a follow-up question. And he smiled and said she always knew what to ask. She smiled back. She cleared the plates. She washed them by hand the way she preferred, standing at the sink looking out the window at the yard where the pecan tree she had planted in November was beginning to show the first tight signs of spring. She was watching. The reckoning took place on a Saturday morning 2 weeks later. In the living room of the house on Parkway Avenue, a room that Simone had furnished herself, with pieces she had chosen carefully, in a house that was hers in every way that mattered before he had ever entered it. She had arranged for 3 people to be present when Deshawn came downstairs: Claudette, who sat in the armchair by the window with a leather folio on her knee; Hattie Monroe, who had come without hesitation when Simone called, and who sat on the small sofa with her hands folded and her posture very straight; and Simone herself, who stood near the fireplace with her coffee and waited. Deshawn came downstairs in a gray sweatshirt and stopped at the bottom of the stairs when he saw the room. He looked at his mother. He looked at Claudette. He looked at Simone. "Sit down, Deshawn," Simone said. Her voice was even and unhurried. He sat. Claudette opened the folio. She set the documents on the coffee table, one at a time, with the calm efficiency of a woman who had done this before, and found no pleasure in it, but no hesitation either. The bank statements first, with the relevant entries highlighted in yellow. The hotel receipts. The wire transfer records. The forensic review summary, which identified $22,400 in marital funds spent on the parallel relationship over 16 months, itemized by date and category. Then a printed public record, the civil judgment from 7 years prior, a different county, a different woman, the same pattern. Claudette had found it in 3 hours. It was a matter of public record. It had simply never been the subject of anyone's search. Deshawn looked at the judgment for a long time. He looked up and said he could explain. Hattie Monroe said from the sofa, without raising her voice or changing her expression, "No, son, you cannot." He looked at his mother. Something moved across his face that Simone recognized as the specific arithmetic of a man realizing that the person he thought least likely to be in this room was in this room, and that her presence meant every version of the story he had prepared was already finished. He looked at Simone. He said her name. He said it was a mistake. He said it didn't mean what she thought. He said they could work through it. That he loved her. That if she would just let him, "You saw what you wanted to see," Simone said. She set her coffee cup on the mantel with a small, deliberate sound. A woman with a modest practice and a second-hand car and enough warmth to believe the best of people. "You never asked what else was there. That was your calculation, Deshawn. I need you to own it." She picked up the folder she had prepared, his copy of everything, organized exactly as Claudette's had been organized, and set it on the coffee table in front of him. "Claudette will be in touch about the separation agreement," she said. "I want this to be orderly. I expect it to be orderly. What it will not be is negotiable." She crossed the room. She picked up her coat from the hook by the door. She opened the door. She did not look back. The pecan tree in the yard was catching the morning light, pale and new. She walked past it to her car. She had some place to be. She had built everything worth keeping. 5 months passed the way they do when you are no longer counting them in someone else's calendar. Simone stood at the window of her new office on Union Avenue on a Tuesday morning in July, watching the street below fill with the particular unhurried movement of a summer weekday in Memphis. She had taken the suite on the 3rd floor at the beginning of spring and had painted the walls herself over a long weekend, a warm gray that her grandfather would have called sensible, which was his highest compliment for anything that was not obviously beautiful but was completely correct. The practice had expanded, a 5th attorney, a client base that had grown steadily enough to justify the space, and a mentorship program she had started in the spring for law students from schools that did not have the networks to place them in rooms where decisions were made. The program had 12 participants in its first cohort. She had funded it herself, from the trust, quietly, without announcement. A man named Marcus Holloway sometimes walked with her to the office on the mornings when his own schedule allowed it. He was a public defender, patient and principled and deeply uninterested in performing for anyone, and he had asked her one evening at a mutual friend's dinner whether she found the work isolating, and she had said yes, sometimes, and he had said he did too. And they had talked for 2 hours in the way that only happens when two people are not trying to be anything other than what they actually are. He was not the center of her life. He was simply a good presence in it. She heard about Deshawn the way she heard about weather in a city she no longer lived in, through people she trusted, without seeking it. The separation agreement had been finalized cleanly, as she had required. The civil judgment from the prior case, now part of the public record in 2 counties, had surfaced when a real estate firm he had applied to ran a standard background review. He was not working in commercial real estate anymore. He had taken a position in property management for a residential complex, a level down from everything he had spent years building his identity around. The woman whose name Hattie had given Simone, the one from before, had been located by Claudette's forensic firm and had provided a sworn statement that had contributed to the civil record. Hattie Monroe had not spoken to her son in 4 months. She had sent Simone a card in May that said only, "Thank you for not hating me." Simone had written back. She had said there was nothing to forgive. She thought about her grandfather on mornings like this one. She thought about him standing at a panel box with his tools laid out in precise order on a cloth on the floor, working in silence, never hurrying, never guessing, trusting the process the way you trust a thing you have learned to do correctly. He had told her once that the most dangerous wiring was the kind that looked fine from the outside, that the damage was always in the connections you couldn't see until you opened a wall. She understood now what he meant in a way she had not understood before. The morning light came through the new office windows the same way it had always come through every window she had ever stood at, patient, unhurried, entirely indifferent to whether you were ready for it. She was ready for it. Bitterness required ongoing emotional investment in people who no longer deserved it. She had other things to build. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.